The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. I'm Robert Gilson. I direct the Art Center at the 92nd Street Y. As always, I'd like to plug my programs a little bit to start out with. The summer catalog is out, and our classes begin the week of June 3rd. This is a great time to be registering, so I hope you'll grab a catalog and have a look. This evening's program with environmental sculptor Elyn Zimmerman marks the final lecture of this year's Artist Visions series. The moderator for Artist Visions is Nan Rosenthal. Ms. Rosenthal is curator of 20th century art at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. She most recently has curated the highly acclaimed drawings of Jasper Johns, which opened last fall in Washington and then traveled here to New York at the Whitney. She's currently working on what she describes as a, in quotes, long overdue book on Robert Rauschenberg. The format for this evening will be as follows. Ms. Rosenthal will introduce Elyn Zimmerman, then Ms. Zimmerman will join Ms. Rosenthal on stage and give a slide presentation of her work. At the end of the slide presentation, there will be a brief pause while the stage is reset up. Then Ms. Rosenthal and Ms. Zimmerman will hold an informal discussion about Ms. Zimmerman's work. The evening will conclude with a brief question and answer period when Ms. Zimmerman will respond to audience questions selected and presented by Ms. Rosenthal. If you would like to pose a question, and we certainly do encourage you, please write it legibly on the index card you received upon entering. The ushers will collect them after the slide presentation. Thank you for joining us this evening. Before I conclude, I would personally like to thank Nan Rosenthal for organizing what I think has been a terrific series. Please help me in welcoming her to the Y.
Thank you, Bob. I'd like to thank you for making everything go so smoothly. I'm very, very pleased to introduce Elyn Zimmerman. I first encountered, or really almost literally walked into or stumbled upon her work when I first moved to Washington in 1985. I was meeting a friend for lunch, an old friend who works at the National Geographic headquarters. And I saw there in front of a new addition to the headquarters, a new building, a plaza with Zimmerman's garden, a Zen garden, really, of boulders and water. You'll be seeing a good deal of it. That's not Zimmerman's garden, that's Ryoanji in Kyoto. I was struck when I first saw this by the degree to which it worked as public art, as a public space. In my experience, a great deal of public art is not terribly successful. And this was inviting, it was tough, it was usable, it was human scale, it was just terribly appealing. It was also very interesting to see in Washington because it was utterly unlike most public sculpture or most public art in that city, which is so very, very full of public art. As you know, there is everything from the ultimate obelisk, the Washington Monument, to all the Civil War generals any crossword puzzle challenge could ask for. I have one on my own residential corner at Connecticut Avenue and California Street. There is a great big General McClellan on horseback, raised on a pedestal that is considerably taller than I am, and circumnavigated by traffic and a very unattractive high-rise Hilton hotel. He looks really quite forlorn. That equestrian statue of McClellan, of course, has a public art tradition that goes back at least as far as the Italian Renaissance, when such equestrian figures stood in the midst of public squares and public ovals, and served not only to commemorate a leader, but also to give visual focus to a planned public meeting space. That function perhaps has somewhat disappeared. And we'll talk about that, Elyn Zimmerman and I, a little later. She was born in Philadelphia in 1945, and in the course of elementary school, moved with her family to Los Angeles, a city, of course, with very few public sculptures. And there she grew up. In 1963, she began studying at UCLA. She took fine arts and photography, but majored in psychology with an emphasis on perception. Her becoming a public artist rather than a painter, which is what she at the very first was inclined to be, or a sculptor of objects for the pedestal or the coffee table, has been a long and ongoing process. As a psych major at UCLA, she did research for the Southern California artists James Turrell and Robert Irwin, who were at that time working on a project for the Los Angeles County Art Museum Art and Technology exhibition. Turrell at that time was he was an environmental artist, still is, who was working primarily with light and taking, say, a studio of his and making slits, open spaces in the walls and ceiling and windows of the studios to do a kind of camera obscura effect, so that the light from the streets, I mean literally traffic lights and other lights in Santa Monica, would come into his studio and function to create a kind of light environment. And this was an influence on Zimmerman early on. She also, working for Turrell in Santa Monica, got to know the painter Richard Diebenkorn, who had a studio there, and he was very encouraging to her, and also became a professor of her, encouraged her to enroll in the MFA program at UCLA, where she studied with him and also studied photography. Around that time, we're now 1969, 70-ish, she really embarked on an extracurricular program of travel or pilgrimages to sites that have educated her and inspired her. Some of them have been really epiphanic, as I think she'll explain. Back then, in the late 1960s, it was Rome, the Pantheon, and Greece that were particular inspirations. But she went on to travel to Morocco, to central and northern India, including the cave temples at Ellora. She saw Spanish gardens and Moorish architecture, Scandinavian prehistoric sites, and monuments and fjords, and not surprisingly, she spent 6 months in Japan. That was in 1982. 3 of those months in Kyoto, studying the temple gardens. She's also visited, more recently, Mayan and Peruvian and Egyptian sites. Around the time Zimmerman obtained her MFA from UCLA, that was in 1972, and it was in painting and photography, she then began to teach at a series of California schools, such as Mills College, Cal State San Francisco, and California Institute of the Arts, about which you heard a little last week. Around this time, there had been significant changes developing in our understanding of this concept of sculpture. These changes may go back as far as the turn of the century, in a way, when Rodin made the Burghers of Calais and sited that sculpture on a very, very, very low pedestal in the town of Calais, so that the citizens of that late 19th century town and the group Sculpture, commemorating some heroes of the 14th century, were on just about the same horizontal plane. In other words, they weren't looking up the way I have to look up at General McClellan in Washington, and they were somewhat conjoined physically. It is not such an enormous jump from that interaction of sculpture and observer to the abstract minimal sculpture of the early 1960s. To take a sort of paradigmatic example, of which I don't have a slide, I'm thinking of something like Robert Morris's mirrored cubes, which in fact are about coffee table height themselves, mirrored on all sides, and they sit on the floor, and it is impossible for the observer looking at them not to indeed look at himself or herself at the same time. The observer and the object are forced to be engaged in a relationship. The interaction between viewer and environment became an important step in many ways towards greater interest in public art. And it, as you'll see, it functions in many respects in Zimmerman's art in particular. In the late 1960s, there were other ways also of approaching public art. That's a slide of one of Michael Heitzer's vast depressions in the Nevada landscape. He and, of course, Robert Smithson, that's Smithson's Spiral Jetty in Utah, began to use the splendor of the American landscape to create an environmental art. If not exactly, in a way, a public one that many people saw at firsthand. I think most of us have experienced these monuments through such photographs as I've just shown you. And they were certainly not alone. Artists in Europe and the United Kingdom, Christo, Richard Long, David Nash, all sorts of light artists, worked along related lines. In the United States, Scott Burton developed a public art with furniture-like objects. It was in this kind of a context that in the mid-70s and early 1980s, Zimmerman developed not as a painter at all, but as a maker of public environments. She began showing her work in New York in 1974 when she was in the Whitney Biennale. She moved to New York in 1978 and several years later married the art historian Kirk Varnedoe. She has studios here in Columbia County, upstate, and she also works a great deal on airplanes, as I think she'll explain to you. That is necessary with public art. Elyn Zimmerman.
Thank you all for being here. It's always interesting to hear somebody else tell your life story. It sounds, you know,
I hope it was accurate.
it was very accurate. I started out as a painter, and I don't quite know how I wound up doing these large-scale public projects. I like to think of them as art in public places as opposed to what it's usually called, which is public art, as though it was some type of art distinct from every other type of art. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about my projects, and I don't know what you do to get the light to go down.
Yeah, could we lower the light? Yeah. Good.
Thank you. These two pictures are of a work of art, a temporary piece that I was able to do at a place in San Francisco that was an alternative art space. It's something like what we call PS1 here. It's a place called Langdon Street, and they invite artists to come and do temporary projects. And I had begun to be interested in things like what water can do as a reflective, piece. And I was able to build a pool inside this old warehouse that was used as an alternative space. And it was the first time I really did something that was so architectural. And it was quite amazing how that reflection seemed to open up the space. A year later, in about
Where exactly is the reflection? I can't.
The reflection is the black pool.
Okay.
In fact, it's called Black Pool, but this is water. And on the slide on your
right.
You're right. All that reflection of the ceiling, that person standing there is being reflected in a pool of water. Okay. And it was temporary. It was just there for about 4 weeks. A year later, excuse me, I can't get this to. At the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, they had a program of temporary, sort of projects, and they had invited me to do a piece in that series. And again, I decided to continue working with water and with light. So there's a long pool of water, which is about 60 feet long, about 6 feet wide, and it's centered around a pillar that was hit with a particular kind of spotlight. So the reflection of the pillar seemed to go down into the floor. It's sort of a project about illusion, and I think of this kind of work as somewhat painterly, as opposed to being a sculptor working with mass and form. These projects led to, excuse me again, the opportunity to work outdoors for the first time at a place called Artpark. And it was a little like being at camp with a group of artists. It's up near Niagara Falls. It seems that what you're allowed to do is to walk around, pick out a site, and then they have people that help you construct things. So the slide on your left is the site I chose before I installed my piece, and the slide on the right is the piece. It's a long panel of polished, it's a long piece of polished granite, actually many panels, that looks like it sort of leads off into the water, which is the river that goes between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario.
How long
how
from the
long is
time
it?
you started the project, I mean, pick the site to completion?
Well, they usually ask you to come up to look at the grounds. Unfortunately, they sort of bring people up when there's snow on the ground, so you're walking around in 3 feet of snow, you have no idea what the site is really like, and you have to plan something, and then you come back in the spring, like May or June, and you stay for as long as it takes you to complete your piece, which in my case took quite a long time because I had never built anything outdoors, and this was what you call a learning experience. Let me go on. That's another view from the side. But it was really a wonderful experience, and it's something you need to do to really give you confidence to work outdoors. It's a place where you can make mistakes. It's almost like a laboratory for outdoor work, and I can't imagine, you know, sort of launching into a real project, a permanent project, without having had this experience.
Elyn, did you deliberately plan to polish the granite so that it would look like water?
Well, that's what I had planned, and I was very lucky. It worked out that way. And what's wonderful about Artpark is that you can actually do things that don't work out, and it is like working in a sort of expanded, like laboratory or studio. So it's not like each project there is perfect. It's something that is somewhat experimental. And from this, I had some good experience working outdoors, and I was offered the opportunity, whoops, let me go back, to propose a project for the National Geographic Society in Washington, D.C. They had an existing building, which is not pictured here, and they built a new building right across from it, and the area between became a small garden and a plaza. And they wanted, because it's, you know, the National Geographic Society, they were looking for an artist that worked with rocks and water. And they sent a group of people to the NEA to look at, you know, the slides there. And they came up with a, you know, roster of names and came to New York and interviewed us. And they asked me to make a proposal, which is what you see here. There's a pool of water about 60 feet long, and it's surrounded by these very large rocks that I had thought would be a simple thing to do, but since I had had no experience, I didn't realize how hard it really was. But here's another view of the plaza. Plaza itself is not that large, and I was interested in the what happens with the water and its reflections and the stone and its reflections, which are sort of different, and how they act as like large mirrors outdoors. And people always say, oh, those rocks are so natural. What did you do? Just went out and found a boulder and sort of, you know, moved it in. The truth is that we had to make these things. They started out as rectangular blocks because boulders just don't come that size. And, you know, sort of more learning experience. I spent a lot of time at this quarry, which is in Minnesota, and I've been working back there the last 10 years. Luckily, they're very nice people and very patient. But here are, you know, we're working on these large boulders.
Had they, I mean, was this something unusual for the quarry? I mean, an artist just walks in, or had
Well, they've worked
Noguchi
with-
been there before you, or, I mean?
Yes, actually he had, but he worked on on a piece of stone that was more of an object, and it was something they understood. They didn't quite understand what I was looking for, and I'd go out into the field and sort of make them pull all these huge rocks that they don't want them. They can't use them for their business as, in making sort of stone panels for architectural buildings. So they thought of this stuff as just things they would throw away. And here I came and sort of reclaimed it, and it made them very happy. But the slide on the right is a picture of what we were working with as a construction site. And I have to say that in the beginning of doing this work, one of the most exciting parts of it was being out there on a construction site and having huge cranes and teams of people and all these guys in hard hats, and I got to tell them what to do, or at least I got to say, this is good and this isn't good, a little to the right, a little to the left. It's an incredible sense of power. I was very lucky on this project because people were very cooperative. It really doesn't always work that way. Then there's a small sort of walkway and garden, and all inside this garden are, these boulders, and it sort of adds to the effect of the boulders in the center of the plaza itself. Let's see. This next project is very, very different, and it's sort of an odd thing. It was for a private developer who was building a hotel and office building complex right near O'Hare Airport outside Chicago. And in fact, on the slide on the right, in the upper right-hand corner, is O'Hare Airport. That's one of the runways. And when I came onto the project, the slide on the left will show you what the site looked like. The hotel was half done, the office building was half done, and there was this huge area in the center that had nothing. It was a place to park cars. And it's the size of a football field. It's 350 feet long and 150 feet wide. And it just was very large. I decided what it needed to be was a series of landscapes. So there's one area that has a lot of plants and trees and a couple of small pools. There's a central area that has a large pool and a number of rocks, in the plaza itself. And then the area on the right is sort of, it's smaller and it has a pool of water, and it's more enclosed. And the important thing was, because the space was so large, to make it a number of different things that people could walk to and experience, which is one of the ways the Japanese think of their gardens too. And I don't pretend to be, on that level, but the idea of making a sequence of spaces was important. And then there really aren't a lot of people at this particular sort of complex of buildings. And the idea of having these rocks become sort of like a number of, of things in this space, sort of filling up the space, I thought that it was a way of sort of, making it more interesting, and you don't feel so lonely walking on this huge, sort of flat granite plain. But
Elyn, that curving line, is that a water channel?
yes, that's. You mean the one that goes from the large pool over to the stairs?
Yeah.
Yes, that's a sort of a stream.
Okay. What happens to the site in the winter?
Well, it's covered in snow, and they clear a pathway between the hotel and the office building so people can go back and forth. And I again thought it might be interesting to see the thing in progress. A lot of times you see artworks like this or large-scale projects, and they're presented all complete. It doesn't really give you a sense of what goes into it and how many people work on it and how complex these issues are, and the electricians, people who specialize in plumbing, people who are, masons and so on. It's a wonderful experience, and it's a real education to work with all these people, and you have to sort of make them feel this is important. It's not like putting in, a toilet. It's making them feel they're making a work of art. And a lot of these contractors spend most of their time just, working on very mundane things. So when they have an opportunity to do something they think is really strange, which they usually do, they're very excited by it. And it's something they often, will bring their people, like their children, to come and see it. So in these two slides, we're placing these boulders across the plaza.
Now, have you fundamentally decided on, how shall I say, the composition, the placement of the boulders back on a model?
Well, the thing is, working on a model on this kind of a project is just an abstract exercise. I had to be there and look at each of these boulders and think about how they would look, one next to the other, and what would happen. And you can't spend all day moving them around either. They're very big things, and there's, they can be dangerous. They're not a rectangular, sort of a cube. They have to be handled very carefully because they can fall out of their slings and stuff. So I would spend a lot of time thinking about where I wanted these things to go, and hopefully it looked all right when I got done. But it's a spontaneous exercise in a way. You're sort of working, it's all beginning to happen at the time you're working there. And there's a little bit of flexibility. You can change your mind, but you can't be, unreasonable that way. That's the stream that goes from the upper pool to the lower pool.
So there are really three different levels.
There are three different levels. I think it changes about 8 feet in height, in topography. I think this slide's out of focus on the left. Almost. And with this project, for the first time, I was very involved in plant materials because a lot of it is planted. Looking at this berm that you see on the left-hand sort of screen, when you're working on something this large, you just take a can of paint and sort of paint on the ground the line you think you want the berm to have. And then I went up in the on top of the roof, and we had walkie-talkies, and the guy who was running the excavating machine would push it one way, and I'd say, no, push it back the other way. It was, it's not like working in a studio, which is, it's exciting. It has a lot of exciting aspects to it. It's also very painful because you have to work with other people, and you're depending on all these other people to help you realize your ideas, and sometimes you just don't agree, and that can be hard. But with this project, we were able to work with a number of landscape consultants that, because there was really a lot of landscaping, and it was a wonderful sort of education for me. I hadn't ever worked with plants before, and I enjoyed doing it a lot, and I continued to work with these things in my other projects. And I know this might seem silly to some people, but I thought this was a sign that I had done something right. Here I created this environment, and when it was almost complete, I got a call from the owner who said, next time you come, I have a surprise for you. And this pair of ducks just took up residence, and they had babies and the whole thing, and it was I felt that they had validated what I tried to do. Not exactly art critics, but, This next project is in Miami, and it was a public project where they had built a courthouse, which you see on the slide on your left. The courthouse is on the right-hand side. It's by an architect called Arquitectonica, and they do very sculptural and sort of colorful things. And that drawing is their drawing, actually, that shows their courthouse from above. And it has pink and green, marble and yellow tile and red, white, and blue glass. And it was really quite a statement. And it was a Percent for Art thing in Dade County. And they asked me to propose a work. And the architect said, we're really glad to have you here, but please don't think of doing anything that's near our courthouse. You know, we think of ourselves as artists as well. So that was fine. And they had planned this pier that sort of led out into this lagoon, and it was going to be a pier on pilings, you know. And there's when I first came to Miami, they took me to see a number of the sites, and one place I went to visit was Vizcaya, which is this old mansion that is made out of a rock called coral rock. It's very beautiful. It's a limestone that has all these, you know, like shells and coral things in it, and it's quarried in Key Largo, and all this sounded so romantic and exciting. I thought this was a great quarry to go to after being stuck in Minnesota all those years. So I proposed an island, and I called it Keystone Island, and you can walk out on this island, and it's there in this slide. It's about 50 feet in diameter, and you know, this is a courthouse. It's mainly for people. I don't know if it's really, I don't know. It's a courthouse, and people who have to go there aren't very happy, and they often have to wait long periods of time. And I thought having a place to walk out and see this, you know, the whole area here is part of a mangrove preserve that's one of the few places left in the area around the city of Miami. And there's wonderful wildlife there. So it's kind of a beautiful place, and this island gives you an opportunity to walk out and see it at close range. And I'd like to see if we can get a slide of the rock itself, because it's really very beautiful. That's looking at it from on top of the roof of the courthouse. I think you can get a sense of the texture of this limestone. It has all these wonderful sort of seashells and things. And on the side that faces the mangroves, there's a number of places to sit that have been cut into the limestone sort of rim. And this water is attached to Biscayne Bay, so it's tidal, and it moves up and down during the course of the day. There's a little tidal pool included in this island.
When you said there's shells, do you mean this is like sort of like a fossil? I mean, you can actually
it is
see
a fossil.
Imprints of shells and
All kinds of animals. I mean,
snails
all kinds of things. Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful.
This project is also completed in Florida. It was a Percent for Art project as well for a cancer hospital on the University of South Florida in Tampa. And the slide on the left is the site before the work, and the slide on the right is the completed project. And this is a special kind of hospital. They do research there, and many of the patients are there for very long periods of time. In fact, they have rooms adjoining the patients' rooms for members of the family to come and stay. And the doctors, the people that work there, are very, very sympathetic, and it's such a wonderful environment. The hospital itself had won a number of architectural awards, and I was just very excited and moved by visiting this and visiting the site. And I had spent some time with one of my parents in the hospital, and when you're inside a hospital for long hours and you hear doctors being paged all the time, it's a very unhappy environment. It's nice to get outdoors. So I proposed this outdoor, it's sort of a place to go and sit and be reflective and contemplative, hopefully. Let's see. This machine. That's the model. I'm sort of showing off by showing this slide. And that's the project. And it's not often when the project and the model really work out so they look like each other. And I was very, very happy with the whole process of working on this. Very often with these public projects, there's no one there to oversee its construction except for the contractor, and there's really no one there who has the artist's interests at heart. And the university was smart enough to hire an artist himself to come and be there every day and report to me exactly what was going on. And he was just wonderful. And in fact, these are the slides that he took. So here's the first step on the left, and then you sort of dig a big hole, and you fill it with all these concrete and steel forms, and there you are. It happens just like that. It only takes 2.5 years, and actually with this project, the hardest part was getting a contract with the state of Florida. It took 4 years to negotiate a contract, which is one of the problems of public art and why a lot of people aren't interested in participating in it. I mean, there's a lot of artists who aren't interested in it. Let's see.
Elyn, while this is still up, I would imagine the architect of this was very pleased about the relationship between.
This was the first time the architect came to the dedication and was very happy about it. He realized that I was using these columns in my piece that reflected off the columns of his building. And he thought it was, that it worked very well and it didn't compete with the building. It was sympathetic to it. And I was pleased to do that. I think it was an important part of the project. And there was a waterfall that it makes a very nice sort of sound, and there's a place to sit, and there's of course a wheelchair access for people in wheelchairs. They can't get down to the seating bench, but they can sit up above and see everything as well, the waterfall and so on.
Were the classical echoes very deliberate? I mean, maybe I just came back from seeing a lot of Doric temples in Sicily.
No, it was true. I thought of this as a sanctuary, and in classical Roman and Greek times, a sanctuary was a place to go for healing and for contemplation, and the idea of it being a circle was certainly it came from the idea of antiquity.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's it. It is.
Thank you very much. We'll be back in a moment. Just the right way, I think.
Did it work out okay?
Could we have the lights down a little bit? It's a little glary. Thank you. Elyn, you showed us all finished projects. And I know from reading about your work, there are also a lot of projects that, for one reason or another, didn't get executed. And I'd be curious about maybe the proportion and also why things, I guess some things are competitions, but other things you've been commissioned to do, but then somehow.
Well, there's a lot of different things. In fact, a lot of public artwork are set up as competitions, which can be very discouraging because you put a lot of thought and work into something, and then it's not accepted. And if you do 3 or 4 of those in a year and come up with nothing, you feel like you've sort of wasted your time in a sense. And then there's projects that everybody's all enthusiastic in the beginning, and for some reason or other, the state, will cut the budget, which happened today, I believe, in some project here in New York State for a public artwork in a prison or something like that. But that happens all the time. So you might think you have a project, but in fact, it disappears or just falls away.
But do you find the better known your projects are, the more queries you get?
Well, you get a lot of invitations, but a number of competitions are blind competitions where the people who are judging them really don't know what, they look at a work, but they don't have any name attached to it. So it doesn't matter whether they ask you because of what you've done before.
How would you describe the difference between what you do and what a landscape architect does?
Well, there are a number of landscape architects who have been in competitions with artists for these public projects. And some of them are very good, and their work is, as good or as qualified as an artist. The thing about landscape architecture, and I've had this question before, is that landscape architects, what they go through in school is very different from what artists go through. And they're trained to think certain ways, and their experiences are very, very different from what an artist does. I mean, I think of myself as coming out of an art background. I took studio classes, I read art history. I don't know, I don't think that I'm solving problems. A lot of landscape architects that I work with always approach what we're doing as we have a number of problems to solve, and this is what we have to do, and we can only, we have these limitations. I think artists and art is a process that's always asking, what else can we do? What more can we do? How can we, make it really different, make it really strange? So there's a real distinction between intentions, I think, in what a landscape architect, or how they approach a project and how I would. And their education, on my notes.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you go about getting to know your client?
Well, it's really been my experience that every project is sort of unique and different. So when I did a project for a private client, someone who's an art collector, and asked me to do something on their grounds, I spent a lot of time with them as individuals and people, and I saw their collection, and I stayed at their house. When you work for a corporation, you just don't have that kind of contact. And very often they don't know what they want. So it's part of your proposal is to, propose something that will excite them and make them want to build what you want to build. And so it's really different each time.
By the way, with terrain, just speaking of a corporate project, the O'Hare, if we are flying into O'Hare, can we look out
the
window?
Look out.
And what side?
Yes, you can. It depends what runway they're using. Well, I was flying in and out so often, I got to know what runways if you're coming in and the wind's coming from the west, I think, then you get to see it. It's right there. If you're on your way to the city, you can have a taxi just stop by.
And was the
just ask them where the rocks are. Most of the people there sort of have an idea.
Was the slab building the hotel?
No, that was what you saw in the photograph was mainly it was an office building.
And what's the name? If you were staying in that hotel, you could ask to stay in the top and look down on the site?
You could look down the site, sure. Mm-hmm. I stayed there very frequently.
I wonder if you could tell the audience a little bit more about the Cold Spring Quarry. I know I'm asking that because I was there once myself, and it was the most extraordinary experience, I thought. And those boulders or great rocks that they don't seem to use, making kitchen countertops.
I could talk about quarries for hours, especially this one in particular. It's the largest granite place in the United States. It's in upstate Minnesota, and it actually has, the facility is there, and they have places where they get the granite all over the Midwest. They're in South Dakota, in Wisconsin, in Canada, and in Minnesota, and there's all different color granites that they have, and it's a huge facility, and they seem to find it interesting that I use what they discard. And it turns out at that particular quarry, and I think it's probably true other places too, they use about a third of what they actually take out of the ground. So I've sort of invented a new market for their materials. They've been very, very nice to me. But it's really just a large plant, and I have a little corner of it that they let me work in. What was your experience there, Nan?
Well, actually, very, very beautiful. It happened to be a snowstorm, and driving up at dawn about 6 in the morning from Minneapolis north through the snow, just virgin snow, and then running all over the place, all these fields with
Rocks.
the rocks of different colors out in the fields, and then the great pits, and running around a little bit with a hard hat. It was just very, very, very beautiful. But you're raising the question of your recycling what they discarded brings up a whole other issue, it seems to me, of public art, whether it is art that's sensitive to issues of the ecology, or does some public art affect the landscape in a negative way? I mean, obviously, I'm thinking of something like Christo's running fence in Northern California. Some people had objections to what that did to the landscape, and of course, when Christo tried to do a project in Central Park, he ultimately was not able to. Possibly New York is the only city that didn't let him do a project. But I wondered in general, I mean, even something like Heitzer's digging those extraordinary depressions in Nevada, what you feel about.
I think that certainly my attitudes have changed. When I saw the Heitzer piece when it was first completed, I thought it was one of the most remarkable things I'd ever seen, and I never thought about its ecological implications. I've become more ecologically aware, and I think a lot of people have, and I don't think you'd have the liberty to do those kinds of works any longer, unless, of course, they're on private land and you're very insensitive to ecological issues. But I think a lot of public art today is really in cities, and it's hopefully, or I keep wanting to say art in public places, hopefully these projects enhance the parks, the gardens, the open spaces, the public plazas, so that you're not thinking about it in terms of green ecology, about planting more trees, but making the environment a more habitable and sort of humane experience. I think a project like Battery Park down at the tip of Manhattan has been very successful, and it's made a number of beautiful public places, and it incorporates a lot of landscape, but at the same time, the sculpture that's there and the hardscape is very attractive, and I visit it very often. I actually sort of live right near there, and it's used all the time.
Another thing I wanted to ask you before we get to the audience questions, I saw an article in the May issue of HG, House and Garden, in which I saw a freestanding, not site-specific piece that seemed to be made of stone, boulders, granite. And I wondered if you're getting into doing objects, freestanding objects that aren't site-specific, or?
I think that I am, because I've had about 12 years now of doing exclusively public projects and outdoor works, and the scale of these projects they're really wonderful, but they don't allow you much time to work in your studio, and I began to feel I was more of a business than I was an artist, and I was out of town, because none of these projects are in New York, they're in Miami. I've been very lucky, they're in great places and not stuck somewhere awful, but I haven't had a chance to really sort of recharge my batteries or think of new ideas, and it's been an opportunity. I've been working at Cold Spring so often on these large projects. They let me begin to work on some smaller things, which they're smaller. They're not small yet. So
how big is this?
It was 11 feet high and 20 feet wide, so it's still quite large, but it's not the size of a football field.
Did you work on that in maquette form first? I mean, did you
No,
plan?
I was actually able to work
work
there.
with
I
the
mean, I
material.
have there's so much stuff around that I can work in. And since I've been working in a particular sort of area, there's a couple of workmen that sort of, what do you call it, moonlight for me. And they do their work, and they usually come to work about 6 in the morning, they leave about 3:30 in the afternoon. So they would stay for a few hours, and I'd pay them, and they do the work for me.
What kind of tools do you use to work granite?
Well, I mean, we have air hammers and chisels and things. I don't actually do much handwork except for the very small stuff because I'm not strong enough, but I stand there while this fellow's working and, whisper in his ear, a little off here, a little off there. So I really feel I have a lot of control. And what's very important is that you find someone who wants to realize your ideas, who doesn't have his own ideas, who's not trying to make something out of your work, but wants to help you make your own work. And I've been very lucky up there. That's why I keep going back.
Well, this is related. One of the audience questions was, do you sculpt or find your boulders or mix and match?
The project at National Geographic, those very large boulders, they were made out of big rectangular blocks because boulders just usually don't come that big. But the smaller pieces, there's a number of smaller pieces, especially the one in Chicago. All those stones are things I'd find, and you'd spend a lot of time going through the fields. You knock on farmers' doors. I saw a couple of pieces I really liked, small pieces I liked, and they're thrilled. If you can carry them away, you usually can have them. So.
Someone asks, well, there's several questions here, and they're interesting. For the hospital project in Florida, why did someone else oversee the construction? Don't you usually oversee the construction?
Well, I can't be at a place every day. I mean, I try to be as consistent with overseeing things, but it takes a long time to do these projects. It takes about 2 years for that one, and something happens, and they wait for a week and a half for the concrete to cure before they pour another, like another pour. Or I wouldn't know if the people installing the steel rebars were doing the right thing. I mean, it would just be, ridiculous for me to make a judgment on that. So there's engineers who work on these projects and oversee that part of it. I'm concerned with how it looks on the surface, and still, I can't be there every day. So it's important to have somebody. When an architect does a building, they're not at each, they're not there for each, thing that happens. They send their second in command or their a junior person to look at things. But I would go periodically, and I didn't mention this in talking about all these projects. How much money you have to spend makes a big difference in how much control you can have, especially for projects in Miami, and it's for the state. You just can't, go up and back on their money, and things are really limited. So you have to plan when it's really important to be there and what you can be effective at.
The same person says, I'd be curious to know what your dream house would look like.
Oh, I've honestly haven't really thought about a house, but I think of these sort of outdoor. I'm from California, and one of the things I loved about California was the architecture was inside and outside, and you see these wonderful patios that became slightly enclosed and then led to a room. So I think before I could figure a dream house, I'd have to figure where it was going to be, because what I would do in upstate New York probably wouldn't allow us to live there. I mean, it wouldn't work. But I think that my spiritual home is Japan, and I think of those wonderful sort of platforms, and these sort of large, their rooms are large and horizontal, basically, that seem to look like a type of landscape. Is the kind of thing I sort of tend to.
You mean raised just a foot
Well,
or
there's
so off the floor.
platforms, yeah, but they're very sort of wide and broad and all that beautiful wood and very spare.
Someone asks if Noguchi has been an influence on your work.
He has. I mean, but I think more of Brancusi in the sense of that large piece that he did in Romania. Is it?
Yeah.
What do you call it? I can't say it. Târgu, where there's a table of silence, this huge table with these sort of pedestals around it, and the gate of the kiss. It's more environmental, and I don't think of the small pieces of Noguchi's work as being a strong influence, but his larger pieces were the sort of courtyards and interior sort of landscapes that he did.
Let's see. How do you consider the presence of your work as object? Is this something you try to avoid since your work does extend into the landscape? I guess I would add to that. I mean, is there a kind of tension between the work as object versus its environmental?
Well, I might be fooling myself, but I like to think of myself as making places instead of things in these projects, and working with the idea of making a space and having a space sort of charged with a quality of feeling or I don't know, a kind of, a texture. In some cases, the materials I use are important because they're with Keystone Island, that is the piece, and it has a particular sort of quality to it, whereas a large piece that's near O'Hare has a lot of I don't know, there's a number of spaces and ways to look at it. So I don't think of it, it's filled with objects, it's filled with these rocks, but I don't think of each rock as an important individual experience. It's the totality of it that's important.
Mm-hmm. Someone asked if any of your projects are in New York City or New York State.
No. I hope someday, but not yet.
Elyn, we've discussed that considerable number of public art projects are not, in fact, terribly successful. And I wonder if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Well,
how?
Unfortunately, the art project is usually associated with an artist's name, and one of the pitfalls of doing this art in public places kind of, the kind of work is that you're not always in control of the work. And a lot of these projects are failures because the artist has been, in cases, sometimes sabotaged by a jealous architect or landscape architect who compromises the work, and the artist has very little control. And unless you've had enough experience with these projects, you don't really know how to protect yourself. And each project has a different constellation of people and forces and things going on, so you don't always, even with experience, you can't always protect yourself. So sometimes these projects end in failure because the artist loses control, or the architect or landscape architect loses control, and the client or the city or the state, will do things that are unreasonable. Also, one of the issues that's sort of really is a plague to all these design professionals and artists working in public spaces is the fact that in the United States, there's so many restrictions, so many codes that you have to follow when you're working in a public place that it homogenizes and sort of tears the soul out of a lot of the work, because you have to have things be sort of regulated in a way. For example, I was in Paris last year, and you look at along the river, there's the quay, and then there's this wonderful sort of place you can walk, and there's no railing. You can fall 15 feet smack into the river. I doubt if very many people die, by falling into the river. But if we wanted to do something, and it's very exciting to walk along an edge like that, and I think architects and artists would like to work with a sense of precariousness or, I don't know, something that's exciting and a little bit titillating. And you simply can't do it here. You have to have certain size railings that have certain size openings between the grates. It's also standardized that it's a plague on this kind of work.
Do you think that being a female artist has been a hindrance in any way with this kind of work, or alternatively a help? That's half a question, and I guess the other question is if in general you think women artists encounter particular problems.
Well, that's the very big questions. I will say that working with construction crews presents a problem for a woman. It really does. There's very, very few women who are out there working with you or working as a bricklayer or a stonemason or something, although more and more there are. But at one point in a project, I mean, it's almost sort of shameless, but I just wanted to get it done, and they weren't listening to me. So I hired a male graduate student from a local college to be my spokesperson, and he went in and he got it done. And he, I tell him what to say, and he'd go and say it, and they would listen to him. And I didn't care. The important thing was getting the project done. So sometimes you have to be
Devious.
Devious, right.
What about more general problems that you think women artists encountered today?
Well, I think that there are a number. What's perverse, well, not perverse, but what's odd is that in the realm of artists working in public spaces, the number of women to men, there's many, many more women doing it. And various people have offered explanations. I don't sort of agree with them, but they're very good artists, and they sort of predominate in this particular arena. But I think in general there is a certain amount of discrimination against women artists, and it's distressing.
What do you think that a jury or a group of people that are getting together to commission artists for projects, for public projects in public spaces, should think about and consider? Well, since juries tend to sort of think of what they already know about an artist and would that work with this new site, and which is sort of a boring way to think. I mean, it's one way, but...
Can I add something to that question?
Sure.
I think that one of the problems with the last 10 years of art in public places has been that these juries often don't include any art professionals. They're people from the community, which is good. They're, sort of people from the arts administration, which is a field I don't quite understand, but seems to come out of nowhere. They have no idea about art, and they don't seem to be able to administrate either. So
they have a whole program in arts administration at your alma mater,
Right, but it's not practical. Somehow it's very theoretical, and they have very odd ideas. And it's you're really dealing with a lot of inexperience, and it would make an enormous amount of difference if these programs try to include artists on these juries, or museum people, or critics, or people who had some idea about art, so it's not something sort of from outer space. And the other thing is that a lot of communities, will say they want a public art program, and their idea of how this will work is that they'll find a project, they'll find an artist, and then it's the artist's responsibility to educate the community or to somehow, gather support for this work. And art is difficult anyway, and I don't know what percentage of the population regularly goes to museums and, looks at art, but when you're in a small community, it's not very many people, and it's been an unfortunate experience of many artists working on these public projects to be thrust out into the community and have to, defend all art, and your own in particular. It just doesn't make any sense. And if these programs want to be successful, they should have some outreach to the community so that people who will be living with this work, don't feel that they've been, impeded on in some way, and they can appreciate what art is and the art process. A good example of it was Tilted Arc.
The Richard Serra piece in the federal, in the federal, front of the federal building downtown. You mean that the community wasn't consulted in advance?
The community wasn't consulted, and it seemed to me that Richard was left to defend his work. What happened to the jury, the group of people that commissioned the work? They knew what they were getting. They saw his maquette. They knew first of all, they knew what he did before. They saw his proposal, and they accepted it. And they seemed to disappear. I mean, I think it was a terrible thing all the way around, but he was sort of, he had to have people, he had to work to get people to support his project, and he wasn't the one, it wasn't that he was responsible, there was a number of people responsible for that.
Do you think there are particular kinds of work, though, that incur negative reactions? I'm thinking something with the somewhat aggressive character of Sarah's Tilted Arc, or sometimes, I guess on occasion, Oldenburg, the irony of say, a giant toothbrush, or which people took as mocking their communities, that there some kinds of art fare more comfortably?
I think it depends on each sort of situation. And for example, when one of the first public art projects was in Des Moines, I think, Calder, was it? The Umbrella. I'm sorry, I can't think of who the artist was. The Umbrella, do you know what I'm talking about? Is that what it was
called? A large...
There was a large public work that in the 60s was put into a community, Milwaukee or one of these cities in the Midwest, and everybody thought it was a joke. They were hostile toward it. It was very unhappy. And over a period of time, they grew to really love it so much. It's become part of the emblem of the city. It's on all their sanitation trucks in the city. I mean, not just, but it's part of their stationery. It comes to represent the city. And the same thing
is in Michigan. It's a city that begins with an F. It's in Michigan, yeah.
Grand Rapids. Who was the artist?
Calder.
Okay,
yeah.
well, it's a good thing if somebody. And it's probably also true about that baseball bat in Chicago, excuse me. I'm no historian, but anyway, the thing is that the communities can come to love these artworks and appreciate them if they feel that they have some handle to sort of get to understand them. And I think that has to do with the museums in the community and the art galleries and so on, too.
Do you think that urban spaces are, as a rule, more difficult or more challenging than spaces that seem to involve a larger quantity of what we usually think of as nature?
I think so, because you have all these restrictions that you have to sort of follow in these urban places. And I mean, there'll be a lot of people using it. There's a lot of practical things that you consider. This brings up an issue. A lot of artists I know are always arguing that art in public places has to compromise so much that it really isn't art. I've heard this from a lot of people. And in some cases, it's true, and you have to make up your mind whether it's worth doing a project or if it's going to be so compromised and so sort of watered down that there's no art left in it. And I think of art as something that's ineffable, some quality, something that makes it sort of unique and unusual and sometimes humorous, sometimes strange or beautiful or whatever. But at the same time, I've had a lot of time to argue this, and I think that there are also limitations on studio work. It doesn't make one better than the other, but there are limitations too about what you can do, how large a canvas might be, or how...
That it's supposed to be portable.
It has to be portable, and is it sofa size, or is it dining room size, or whatever. So I mean, there's compromises that people make in all kinds of artwork. I'd hate to think of artists not working in the public arena because of these compromises. You have to work around them and be careful on the projects you choose. Certainly, in a situation like Battery Park, there were all the players in it were right. The architects were sympathetic to the idea of including artists in the project. The jury that chose the artists was all art professionals of a very high level, and it made a big difference. You have a wonderful place there.
Actually, related to that answer, someone in the audience asked what your reaction to two-dimensional art. What is your reaction to two-dimensional art that explores some of the same subjects as yours, light and rock landscape? I mean, such as April Gornick, who was here last week. What your feeling is about that kind of painting. Does it interest you?
It interests me very much. I mean, I love looking at landscape painting, you know, contemporary, historical, and I even dabble in it myself every now and then. So I'm very interested in it, and I feel it's a whole other kind of experience. I mean, you project yourself into a painting in a way that you experience a three-dimensional work in a very, you know, it's an experience with your whole body. You're walking through space. It's not as much about imagination as when you look at a painting. I think they're very, very different, and you know, each one has its important qualities.
Have you seen any projects in Europe or Asia? I mean, projects done in the last 10 or 15 years that you thought were particularly interesting?
Public works? I've seen pictures. I haven't actually, I'm trying to think, I haven't actually seen projects, but in Europe there are a number of places or cities that do temporary projects, like Kassel does Documenta in Germany every 4 years, and they invite people to do you know, large-scale temporary projects. And there's a number of private art patrons who have, you know, sort of villas in the hills in Tuscany and various other places that invite people to do projects too, but they're not always open to the public. But I can't think of... But they are mostly temporary things. I mean, I partly asked that question because there's so much more money automatically assigned from public funds in Europe, and yet it strangely doesn't seem to have... Well, no, in Paris and in France in general, there's a number of public art projects. Some of them are interesting and some aren't. I mean, I'm not... what I've seen, I haven't been that moved by, but there are a number of opportunities that have opened up that hadn't existed before. Especially right outside Paris, there's a satellite city, I guess, called La Défense, and they've been inviting a number of artists. In fact, Richard Serra did a very large piece there that's handsome for there. I mean, it works well there. You mentioned a piece that's about 11 feet tall and 20 feet, and you said you might get smaller. Can you imagine such a thing as an exhibition in a gallery? I can dream. This isn't a great time to be making, you know, and thinking of making large pieces of sculpture out of granite and thinking of ever selling them, but the art market being what it is. But yes, I'd like to do that. That would be something I'd like to do. Ellen, thank you very, very much. You're welcome. Fascinating.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.